Okay, well, good evening to everyone. I'm Christine Condolian, the George and Margot Barakis Senior Curator of Greek and Roman Art. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this year's, I can't even say it, 19th Estelle Showett-Bretman Memorial Lecture. This series was funded by the International Catacomb Society that promotes the preservation, restoration, and publication of the catacombs, as well as awarding grants to scholars in ancient Mediterranean studies. Estelle Bretman was a frequent lecturer at the museum and a passionate student of the Roman catacombs. I would also like to extend this evening a special welcome to the Greek Study Fellows and Associates in the Examined Life program. For nearly 20 years, the Examined Lives program has enriched the lives of teachers across America who teach thousands of students about the relationship of the ideals of ancient Greece to the world of today. As one of the Examined Life's honorary board members, I've been delighted to participate in the program's lectures, workshops, and tours here at the MFA. Tonight, it's a great honor to introduce tonight's speaker, Pavlos Geroulanos. Mr. Geroulanos was born in Athens, Greece in 1966. He's no stranger to our shores, however. Pavlos graduated from Williams College with highest honors and a degree in history in 1988. Full disclosure, I had the pleasure of teaching Pavlos Byzantine art when I was a professor of art history at Williams. In 1994, he received a master's degree in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and a master's in business administration from the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And I found out tonight he's also been playing rugby. From 2009 until 2012, Mr. Geroulanos became a member of parliament with a pan-Hellenic socialist movement known as PASOK. And he joined the cabinet of Prime Minister George Papandreou. Included in his duties as Minister of Culture and Tourism was sports and public television. He's founding member and president of the board of Class Act, a nonprofit that helps to build neighborhood support for Greek public schools in Greece, of course. From 1994 until the present, he's been running Kefalonia Fisheries with his wife on the magical island of Kefalonia. Think Corelli's mandolin. As part of the founding family of the Benaki Museums of Greece, Mr. Geroulanos is actively involved in promoting their mission around the world. I might say on a personal note of thanks to his family because they warmly greeted the MFA patron travelers for a private tour and reception of their museum in Athens. It was truly a memorable evening. Tonight he will present the Benaki Museum and the Greek narrative. Warm welcome to Pavlos.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Barbara, for co-inviting me here. And thank you to the teachers of the Examined Life program for the work you do to promote Greek culture, but also the work you do in American schools. Thank you to the Greek contingency that is here for opting to be here, actually. Even I was tempted when I heard that the Greek freak is playing the Celtics today on the other side of town. And of course, thank you for my rugby mates for being here. Guys, I promise to return the Greek you knew the moment the lecture's over. How are you doing? When Christine and I were preparing this talk, Christine made it perfectly clear that this should not be a political talk, it should be about culture. And I thought that was fair. But the more I started thinking about the twist of the talk, the more the distinction bothered me a bit. And that is because we can't separate culture and politics. Why would you? Our culture and politics are expressions of human thought, human emotion, and rational as well as irrational behavior. And when allowed to express ourselves freely, we the people express consciously or unconsciously, both and at the same time, through culture and through politics, what we believe in. So they both reflect the values that we share at any time. Both reflect who we are, what we believe in, and they showcase our identity because they are both our parents and our children. So in a democracy, there cannot be a cultural talk without politics, and I certainly hope there's no political talk without culture. It is in this very nature of our humanistic tradition, the tradition that Greeks and Americans share, that culture and politics are completely inseparable. So, I have to apologize, Christine, but any which way I turned this lecture, it kept coming out political. Besides, it's the first time I've been in your country since your election. And there's a couple of things I need to get off my chest. Do not worry, though, if Christine is fired by the end of my talk. I'm sure there's a lovely liberal arts college at the end of Massachusetts that will be happy to get her back. My focus then today is about how culture is important in building solid societies. How we weaken our communities, and therefore ourselves, when we remove people, and therefore culture, from our decision-making process. How several perils facing Greece today have their roots in violations of our tradition and our culture in the way we built the modern Greek state after the Greek Revolution, the way we built the Greek economy after World War II, and the way we have been handling the crisis that most of you have heard about. And finally, how the crisis is an opportunity to right these wrongs if we build a future true to who we really are, and how cultural institutions can help us do exactly that. I will use an institution I deeply care about as the example. Christine spoke about my connection to the Benaki Museum. But the reason I like it is not that our family is connected to it. I like it because it's the only museum in the world that covers Greek history and art from prehistoric times until today. The only one in the world. It is the second most visited museum in Greece. It is made up of 5 buildings. This is the central one, and there's another 3 in the making. And these buildings house 120,000 artworks from the Paleolithic era until today, 10,000 prehistoric ancient Greek and Roman artifacts, 5,000 Byzantine icons, artifacts, and Coptic textiles, 2,000 liturgical vestments and vessels, 24,000 pieces of Neo-Hellenic art, historic heirlooms and coins, 32,000 artworks of contemporary Greek artists, 30,000 toys in one of the most incredible collection of toys in the world from ancient times until today, 10,000 paintings, drawings, and engravings, 15,000 artifacts of world culture, including one of the most important Islamic collections in the world, 4,000 archival pieces of history, architecture, and performing arts, a library of 180,000 books, 500 of which have been published by the museum itself, 400 manuscripts of tremendous value, and the photographic archive of 700,000 negatives and 80,000 original photographs. Basically, since its foundation, the Benaki Museum has become a depository of trust for Greek collectors, an ark, if you will, of Greek heritage and of human creativity. And as such, it remains today one of the most useful tools we have to understanding who we are, why we are who we are, and who we can become. Through its collections and archives, the Benaki covers every aspect of Greek life, Greek history and art. Prehistoric, Homeric Greece, Minoan, Cycladic, and Mycenaean art, the Trojan Wars and the glory of Athens, Alexander the Great, Greece in Roman times, Byzantine Greece, Greece under the Ottoman rule, the Greek Revolution, the Balkan Wars, where Greece doubled its territory, the Great Schism, the big divide in Greek politics right after that, and World War I, the Asia Minor catastrophe, the prolific 30s, the period between the wars where Greek artists were extremely productive, the Second World War and the Greek Civil War, the dictatorship and the reinstitution of democracy in Greece, all the way to performing arts and exhibits today. The long history of a very ancient civilization and a very young nation all under one roof. But why is this important? It is important because that is not the way we Greeks learn our history, nor is it the way that we portray our history in our museums. A young Greek starts their lessons with mythology in the very first years of their teaching, a bit like, a storytelling narrative in the very beginning. Then we get a bit more serious with Homeric Greece and the expedition against Troy, Minoan, Mycenaean again, and Cycladic art, the Persian Wars, the glory of Athens, the glory of Alexander the Great, and then nothing. As if Greek culture and heritage disappears in the 400 years, the 500 years of the Ottoman Empire. And then out of nowhere appears this empire, the Byzantine Empire, which is Christian in religion and Greek-speaking, where Greeks can identify with, and we learn again the history of this 1,000-year empire as if it is part of our heritage, but a different part than what we had before. And then darkness again. 400 years of Ottoman rule, as if Greece disappears. In fact, the narrative of those years is more or less summed up in a picture of a priest in a dark room teaching Greek to a Greek student. While it was not like that. It was a time where Greeks were extremely prolific and Greek culture survived and did amazing things. And then, again seemingly out of nowhere, the Greek Revolution. Now, I've always loved this painting because it goes exactly against the narrative that we learn in school. We learn about this dark room, black-wearing priest and a little child, and here you see a huge cathedral, a priest dressed in gold, and the swearing of the fighters of the Greek Revolution, obviously people of wealth and taste. And then darkness again. Because Greek history for a Greek student ends right before the beginning of the 20th century. Why these dark periods? Well, there's a variety of reasons. Many teachers will say there's too much material to cover. It's too much to go into everything. Too little glory, too few heroic battles, and too many controversial subjects, such as the Civil War and Greek dictatorships during those periods. As if Greek civilization perished when it was not fighting battles. But in doing so, the Greek educational system breaks up the fascinating continuum that is the progress of Greek spirit throughout the ages. And thus every Greek kid grows up with a very unfortunate choice. Am I the son and daughter of the ancients? Or am I defined by my Orthodox faith, the glory of Byzantium, and the heroic Greek Revolution? You see, a fragmented narrative of our history leads to a fragmented understanding of who we are. Do we belong in the West, which was shaped by our forefathers' ideas? Or are we part of an Eastern tradition shaped by our Christianity and 400 years of Ottoman rule? To be fair, some Greeks are sick and tired of the debate altogether, and they just want to be citizens of a modern Greek state, a modern democratic state who wants to build its own future. Now, how relevant is the debate? Let me phrase the question in a different manner. What is the price you're willing to pay to stay in the euro? Very relevant. And not only very relevant, the debate is very passionate. It doesn't always appear this way, but this is the underlying current below. When forced to make a choice, however, two things happen. First of all, we abandon things that are ours, that are true to our nature, and we pick up things that are not to fill in the gap. The process is not only extremely painful, but if not done with sensitivity, it actually derails progress and throws you back several decades. There are no dark periods in the Benaki Museum. Just a constant, uninterrupted stream of Greek creativity, linking every period to the ones before it and the ones after, linking the Greek civilization to those who we influenced and those who influenced us. These are two paintings of El Greco at the Benaki Museum. I love them because they show, there's the same painter at the very beginning of his life, painting two completely different styles, both of which are absolutely brilliant. In a seamless progression, the Benaki links us Greeks to our forefathers, and in doing so, it encourages us not to make choices between periods, but to embrace the whole narrative as a beautiful expression of Greek creativity and therefore the Greek spirit. So if you want to meet the Greeks, if you want to understand the Greeks, if we Greeks want to learn about our culture better and know our history and heritage, all aspects of who we are without gaps, without myths, without blind spots, all we need to do is understand the wealth that is the Benaki Museum. And more importantly, the value of the people who created the wealth in the Benaki Museum. Which brings me to today. The Greek crisis. How many of you have heard about it? Okay. Depending on who you talk to in Greece, there is a lot of blame to be thrown around. Multiple scenarios of what went wrong. Some people will point to the current prime minister and the fact that he decided to have a referendum at the time that the Greek economy was almost ready to recover. 3 years ago, people will blame Samaras and his insistence on having elections. 7 years ago, people will point to Papandreou and his choice to show the real statistics of the Greek economy to the Europeans. 10 years ago, they will blame Karamanlis and the ballooning of the Greek debt. 20 years ago, they will blame Simitis, the Olympics, and the Euro. 70 years ago, the way we set up our modern economy after the Second World War. 200 years ago, how we built our state. And finally, a scenario that's shared, unfortunately, with some people, rather uneducated people in Brussels, 5,000 years ago, and the shaping of the Greek character. People tend to be partial as to who and what is to blame for the crisis. I know I am. But the real question we should be asking is, are there lessons in there we can learn in order to build a better future? And right away, I can tell you that there's not much point of insisting on trying to understand what happened with the Greek character, because even if it is at fault, there's nothing we can do about that. There's also very little we can learn by blaming prime ministers and what they did. there's even less point on trying to undo what they did. So, forgive me, the only two scenarios that I find value is the 70-year-old scenario, which points to how we built our modern economy, and the 200-year scenario that points to how we built our modern state. And the two are extremely linked. So, so I'll start from the beginning, and by using examples of how things can go wrong if we take people out of the equation and we make decisions disregarding our real nature and who we really are. Now, if you walk on the second floor of the Benaki Museum, you will see an amazing array of different costumes, all from Greece. And it does not take long to realize how varied they are. From costumes that have strong influences from the West, to costumes that could easily be worn in the steppes of Afghanistan, and practically everything in between. All Greek, each village and each island on its own, a symbol of the value that we place on uniqueness. Like our costumes, our tastes are local, our produce is local, our products and our recipes are local. And if you go to Greece, most of you know tiropita, which is cheese pie, right? If you go to Greece, you will notice that not even our fast food joints have managed to standardize that product, and they all have to offer 4 or 5 different options to make sure that they cover every Greek and their demands. And you might know feta, but what we need to know is where it's coming from, because we know the differences there. All our cheeses, in fact, and our olive oil. Same with our fruits and vegetables. Obviously, with our wines and spirits. A distilling process in Crete is named something completely different than the same distilling process in Epirus. We can tell subtle differences, and therefore we have preferences. In some ways, where you have brands, we have toponymia, which is the names of locations. And this is by no means new. If you look into Greek history and ancient times, you will find the idea of the polis, which, where although the cities all shared a Greek identity, they each felt and were extremely autonomous. It wasn't one country. It was many different cities. An Athenian could not be a Spartan, and a Spartan could not be an Athenian, a feeling that is very much alive today. Partly kept alive, of course, by the mountainous regions that divide the country and the various islands that are inhabited. For me, these costumes are living proof that, to anybody who's willing to listen, that our ancient tradition and regionalism was still very much pronounced in the 19th and early 20th century. And we're still very proud of it. I always say when they ask me, where do you come from? I say I come from an island on the west coast and a little village on the island called Lixouri, where not even my great-grandfather was born there. It always fascinates me how when we go out with my American friends and they ask them, where are you from? They will say the city that they're living in now. And I say a city that not even my great-grandfather was born. And in fact, in Kefalonia, we define sectionalism as anybody, a sectionalist as anybody who mistakenly thinks that his land is more beautiful than ours. Another room I find very interesting in the Benaki is the room that hosts tens of paintings of foreign visitors who visited Greece during Ottoman times. The greatest majority of these paintings are of ruins, and the greatest majority of those are of the Acropolis. In one room, you realize that when the Europeans and their allies helped us liberate from the Ottomans, they had in mind something very specific they were liberating. They wanted to revive the country and the children of the ancients. And not only any ancients, the ancient Athenians, the forefathers, the inspiration of their own Renaissance. But that's not what they found in Greece. They found a new nation where you had Greeks and Vlachs and Arvanites and Jews and Muslims and Turks and Slavs who had evolved through centuries. This is a picture of the Acropolis, one of the many paintings of the Acropolis. What they found, it was a young country who had had influences from East and West, from immigration, migration, trade and shipping through 2,000 years of history. And those 2,000 years had left their mark on the population, as well as preserved the multiple facets of Greekness and Hellenism on the regional level. And although no people in the world might become ever as prolific as our ancient forefathers in Athens 2,000 years before, the 2,000 years that had spanned since then in many ways had made us a far richer nation in all aspects of our life and culture. At least changes that you could not ignore. But the progress we had made away from the ancients and the very fragmented nature of our country bothered many people, including some of the Greek leadership, especially those who were expecting to recreate ancient Athens. So in 1833, Greek leaders, with our allies, started doing something no politician or leader should ever do. They started rewriting history and erasing parts of it. In an effort to unify Greece and re-Westernize Greeks, our allies helped establish a very powerful central state and established a Bavarian king on top of it. Two very un-Greek institutions. So much was the need for centralized power that all peripheral institutions, including the judiciary and local government, were kept extremely weak and always dependent on the central state. Without a constitution until 1843, the king ruled more or less with absolute power, and after his fall, the state took over more or less with the same kind of power. Interestingly enough, one of the purposes of the original centralized state was to collect taxes so that the Greeks would repay the money they owned from having the revolution, which is very much mirrored with what you see today in the Troika, the European body that is overseeing Greece today and the repayment of its debt and creditors, where they're also pushing for a stronger centralized state, as few decision-making bodies as possible, and one centralized fund managing all Greek assets from the smallest beach to the largest state corporation, leveraged all of them together in order to guarantee the Greek debt. Needless to say, this king lasted approximately 30 years, and the monarchy struggled on and off until 1974, where Greeks voted against it. But the centralized state persisted and actually grew in power ever since, managing and distributing wealth essentially through very strong clientelist relationships, which very often today they say, oh, you know, Greeks are corrupt and that's why you have the crisis. Which brings me to the slow death of Greek creativity and the perils of the Greek economy we face today. How many of you have heard the term Dutch disease? All right. It's an economic term. It refers to the problems that occur when an economy is over-dependent on a natural resource and what happens to it when the resource runs out. While the economy depends on the resource, people stop producing what they're traditionally good at, and that leads the economy to fail when the resource runs out. It took the Dutch approximately 15 years to recover from a 15-year dependency on natural gas. Well, since 1945, the Greek economy has grown as if it has discovered gas. And here's how. In the 1940s, the Greek economy was very strongly supported by the Marshall Plan. These were US funds that were sent to Greece to keep Greece away from the communist bloc and the USSR. The little girl that you see here is looking at her shoes these are brand new shoes that were given to her from the Marshall Plan. The photographer, by the way, is a legendary photographer, and we were planning to bring her exhibit here in the United States. So in the 40s, we had the Marshall Plan. In the 50s and the 60s, we got money that came from Greek immigrants in the US, in Australia, and in Germany. In the 60s and 70s, shipping capital was repatriated back to Greece, primarily because ship owners who had become extremely rich, you know some names like Aristoteles Onassis and Niarchos and so forth, were bringing their money back to Greece. And then in the 80s, 90s, and 2000, we got a ton of money from the European Union. Together with a stock market bubble, a real estate bubble, and easy credit, you can understand how the Greek economy felt much richer than what it was producing. And we all, as Greeks, felt richer than we really were. At the peak of the market, I sold my little apartment in Athens and have been living off it since then. For the past 70 years, the Greek economy has grown as if in a perpetual Dutch disease, killing off industry after traditional industry and putting in its place a central state, driving development without a plan, feeding with cash either the public sector or state-owned enterprises or overpriced agricultural products that cannot be sustained anymore. Greek banks and Greek enterprises have become completely hooked on subsidized government contracts and debt from government-controlled banks. This progression could not have peaked at the worst time. If you look back into the 90s and the 2000s, you will see the makings of a perfect storm. A centralized state that controlled most of the Greek economy and assets through foreign subsidies and essentially squandered anything else that tried to grow through bureaucracy. Easy credit and a new wave of consumerism that drove Greeks away from their traditional products and to imports. A very heavily urbanized country where about 50% of the population lives in one city. A European Union requiring further standardization of production and discouraging niche activities. A globalized economy in demand of low-cost mass production to drive productivity. Each on its own, but more importantly together, they pushed the Greek economy away from its core competencies, weakened its unique multifaceted character, and thwarted productivity. When the funds keeping the Greek economy ran dry, Greek society was left in shambles, and Greek creativity was left wondering what in the world just happened. Plus two very disturbing problems. One, an economy that had forgotten what it was good at producing and therefore could not stand anymore on its own 2 feet. And two, a leadership that does not know how to get us out of the crisis. Primarily a political leadership, but not only. The political leadership, through these years, learned how to distribute wealth, but they don't have a clue about how wealth is created. The political leadership, the corporate leadership, banking leadership, the media leadership, and the judiciary have no clue what a Greece without subsidies would look like. Greece without handouts would look like, primarily because they've never had to deal with one. They've never had to service one. So to sum it up, in a span of 100 years, Greeks strengthened an all-powerful centralized state, a form of government that was completely unnatural to our nature and our needs. We abandoned industries we knew for industries, products, and services that would be subsidized, competed on labor costs as opposed to investing in the abundant and well-educated human capital, opted for mass markets as opposed to authenticity and uniqueness and niche markets, and we weakened traditional small and family-owned businesses for the sake of large multinational chains. Now, this is of particular interest to me. Right now, we have a situation in Greece where one of the biggest supermarkets is completely failing. It hasn't failed yet, but as it is failing, it's driving down prices of producers in the countryside, completely destroying the most important, the healthiest jewels in the Greek economy. Now, I'm not claiming that if anybody is handing you money, you should say no, obviously. Nor do I believe that subsidies are not useful tools to guide your economy or to grow it at some point. But what happened in Greece needs to be looked at as an example to be avoided. Nor am I claiming that all the problems of the Greek economy would suddenly disappear through decentralization, through boutique production and services, and solely by investing in the uniqueness that is Greek creativity. What I am saying that in a world where quality and authenticity has a very lucrative and expanding market, where unique experiences are taking over mass travel, where energy is produced by wind and light, and where geographic proximity to rich economies is a source of wealth, Greece is perfectly well suited to grow on its own 2 feet. And in a world where health, happiness, and well-being are becoming paramount to a very lucrative market, the Greek way of life, Greek history and tradition, the Greek countryside, Greek farms and Greek produce and the Greek diet still constitute the lowest hanging fruit in order to stop the downfall of the Greek economy and start building it again from the beginning. As long as Greek creativity is allowed to flourish and Greeks start remembering again what they were good at producing and servicing. What I'm saying is that in order to grow our economies and by extension strengthen our societies, we need to do it by keeping people in the center of the design process, since they will be the ones carrying the load. That we should remain true to our nature and who we are in order to avoid killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And that all creativity, the source of any economic development, is deeply rooted in our nature and therefore in our tradition and our culture. Ladies and gentlemen, museums, like other cultural institutions and educational institutions, are key to understanding who we are. That is why I deeply believe that museums should not only showcase the artifacts that they collect, they should showcase the people behind the artifacts and, more importantly, the values of the people behind the artifacts. Things we create, from very high culture until the plates we eat from, are threads that in the tapestries of our uniqueness. And the pattern that the threads create show what we're made of, what we're good at, our talents and our dexterities, as well as our shortcomings and our weaknesses. In other words, who we are, our culture and our nature should always remain central drivers when building our nations and growing our economies, or we're bound to become something we're not. And that is a very precarious and unsustainable place to be. So if the nature of who we are is still the best guide on how to run our communities and by extension grow our economies, then cultural institutions are uniquely qualified to help us do that. And hence, my dear Christine, lies my call to make museums like the Benaki and the MFA far more political. To make museums who study our heritage and tradition take an active role in helping us understand who we are, and by extension participate constructively in how we run our democracies and how we grow our economies. To make them, in other words, into institutions that help us connect with our true nature in order to help us be the people that we can and want to be. And thus to be institutions driven by the will to reach out to all people, not just a few, not just the elites, and not just the inquisitive. Now, I have walked the halls of the Benaki Museum for decades, fascinated with what makes us Greek, looking for symbols that connect one period to the next. And one day I asked my sister, who runs the museum, I said, Irini, is there one symbol that spans across generations? Is there one symbol that lasts throughout our whole history, from ancient times until today? And she said, without blinking, she said, the winged human. Sometimes a god, sometimes an angel, sometimes Cupid, sometimes an inspiration, sometimes a lover, but always human in nature. A human that surpasses his or her own limitations to inspire in the rest of us everything we can be. We all strive to surpass our limitations, and as Greeks today, we're called to do it in a much more intense and speedy way than many people have done before us. But we cannot do it by being something we're not. The only way to surpass our limitations is to stay true to who we are and build on that which we're good at. So in view of our history, in view of our brightest accomplishments and our biggest shortcomings, and in view of all there is we can tap into to be who we want and can be, my advice to those trying to help Greece out of the crisis today, and here I mean both the Greek leadership and our European counterparts, is to stop trying to put a straitjacket on our nature and help us invest in who we are and what we do best. In other words, let Greeks be Greeks. And when you have some time to walk the halls of the Benaki Museum, if for no other reason to realize that when we remain true to who we are, true to our nature and our culture, there is absolutely no limit as to what we can achieve. Thank you. Yeah. I understand now you grill me.
Yeah, we'd love for any questions. There's a microphone on either side of the room, so please do wait till the microphone reaches you. Questions, comments? Christine.
So I wanted to know, this is an excellent point and something that we are very concerned with here, the leadership and curators and educators and interpreters at the MFA about reaching out in different ways and being more politically involved with the community. So I'm wondering, has there been any leadership and innovative ideas and exhibitions in Greece altogether, but particularly at the Benaki, because this call to action is a good one, but have there been any steps taken in presenting programs or exhibitions that you consider successful in addressing these issues?
I don't think there have, and the reason that I don't think they have is because traditional thinking leads us back to the artifacts. It leads us back to what it is we consider brilliant. So for example, when exhibit goes abroad, what people are asking for is the exceptional pieces, usually gold, if possible. Marble as a second option, and then everything else. The idea of a narrative is not very pronounced, and I'm sorry to say that there was a wonderful exhibit called The Greeks that was in Chicago and in Washington, and that would have been a great opportunity to sort of build a narrative, but it didn't. And I think one of the reasons why they don't is because they don't want to get into controversial subjects that where you have to make difficult choices, where you have to showcase things that are not, let's say, easily palatable. If you look at the way we present the ancient Greeks, for example, there's nothing they did wrong. It's not entirely the case. And we have a deep need to protect our glorious moments in order to portray them in a way, but that has limitations as to how educational the exhibits become.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. And I want to come back to understand what Let Greeks Be Greeks implies to you in terms of the economic problems and political problems that you face. The funds that you're now receiving, the current stage of the Dutch disease, are being used mostly to service the debts that you have. So they're not extra funds. And the conditions being put on the Greek government has to do with changes in tax policy, transfer payments, and so on, rather than trying to shape the nature of the Greek economy in
Right.
terms of industry.
Right.
So what would you like to, I guess there are two parts to my question. First is, are those conditions that are being imposed limiting the scope of industry and the economy in Greece? And second, what would you like to see done in Greece to let the Greeks be Greeks?
Well, let me start by saying, first and foremost, I wouldn't like anybody to leave here thinking that what I'm saying is give more money to the Greeks. Actually, quite the opposite. What I do believe is that there is amazing underutilized assets in Greece, things that could start producing wealth in Greece right away. And we have made the list of these assets, and then we try to look at all the things that are keeping them from being exploited in the good sense of the word. And we keep coming back to a centralized state that needs to control everything, but at the end of the day, controls nothing and puts nothing to work. So a very fast decentralization of power and assets would be one of the first things that I would look for in order to get the Greek economy investing in those assets, because then you get many small investments by Greeks as opposed to always waiting for the big foreign direct investments that will come and buy the previous airport or will buy, let's say, an old hotel or something like that. That is the one side. But there's also a lot to be desired in terms of the reforms that the EU is pushing for. We see that the reforms, instead of being pushed in order to modernize the economy, they're being pushed in order to collect money. Now, the problem with having reforms in order to collect money is that you end up doing the same mistakes that the Greek government did in the previous years. So, for example, we're talking about tax reform, right? But every 6 months that the Greek government does not meet the amount that it has to pay its creditors from taxes, guess what they do? They change the tax rate. Now, there's nothing more counterintuitive in developing an economy than having a tax rate that changes every 6 months. Because, I mean, in my company, we have money that we want to invest in the economy, in our small local economy, and we're just sitting on it because we really don't know which side of the bed the government is going, or any government, not just the current, will wake up the next day and what they will want to collect. So they're delaying the growth of that particular economy because we don't know the taxes that are coming. And that's not the only one. Here's one that usually is in sync with the American way of thinking. One of the other reforms that they push for is privatizations. Now, privatizations are a good thing, and I'm all in favor of them, despite the fact that the word socialist is in the title of my party. But privatizations are made in order to break down government companies and re-regulate the market. But those are not the privatizations that bring the most money into the economy. The privatizations that bring the most money into the coffers of the government, the privatizations that do are the privatizations where you sell monopolies, essentially. Now, they don't call them that, but the legal structure around these privatizations is so tight that barely no one else can get in the market for some years. And now we all know that there's one thing that's worse than a public monopoly, and that is a private monopoly. So here's an example. The Athens airport was constructed by the Germans, and the management of the Athens airport was given to the Germans. And I will be the first one to say that it's one of, compared to our old airport, it's beautiful, it's safe, it's clean, there's lovely shops inside, it's lovely to go through. But it's the second most expensive airport in Europe, which basically means that before we even start discussing the development of Athens, we're keeping out low-cost carriers. If you land in Madrid, your plane will land, and to each side of you, you will have low-cost carriers. If you land in Athens, there's no low-cost carriers. None of them land in Athens. They go directly to the islands, which has deprived the Athenian economy from an element that could actually help develop it. Now, there's more examples like that where reforms, which are badly needed in the country, because they're done for the wrong reasons, they produce completely different results than expected.
I think the Greek government, of course, is constantly criticized now, but as an art historian and an archaeologist, I'm thrilled as I go back every few years and see more and more beautiful museums being opened in the most far-flung places of Greece, whether around the Peloponnesus at Patras or Messina, or in northern Greece, Thessaloniki, of course, and then in small local museums along the northern coast, and beautiful improvements in museums in Athens. Of course, many of these museums are very underused. They're not popular. I think in the long run, this is going to enhance people's appreciation of Greece. Is there any way that these huge investments can be somehow used to power the Greek economy out of this hole that it's in?
It's lovely that you say that, because yes, there's been an incredible amount of money invested in building new museums and showcasing the beauty of everything we have to offer. But again, these museums are mostly built by EU subsidies, which are great to build the infrastructure, but then they don't sustain it. Now, one of the things we had to do when we were cutting down the budget in the Ministry of Culture was to close down some of those museums because we didn't have the people we couldn't pay for the people. And here's where the centralized state comes in. We had to pass a law which would allow us to cooperate with local government so that local government, which had excess people, could actually use them to keep these museums open. Because until now, the central government would not allow local governments to come in and help us with managing these museums. And as a result, these museums were completely detached with any planning that the local governments did. So the local governments were oblivious to the richness that they could tap into because they didn't consider it theirs. I have a lovely example of a mayor who found me at some point and he said, Minister, can we build a museum? I said, sure, but what are you going to put in it? He said, well, you have some things in the vaults, just send us some stuff. The guy was sitting on another huge investment with EU money on the delta of a river, with amazing biodiversity, which could be leveraged in order to bring tourists from all over Europe. And the guy didn't even know he was sitting on that asset. Again, it was something built by the state, controlled by the state, unconnected with the local community, and as a result, it was never part of the planning. We're just seeing changes in that, where local government is starting to ask, wait a second, there's richness here that I can take advantage of and bring wealth to my community. And now suddenly they are asking for access to these assets.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. I learned a lot from you, and I learned two important things that I have struggled in my life. One of them is what you said before this last aphorism. What is the overarching common symbol from the very beginning to today? And I could not agree with you more. It is that winded character. And to me, that is an excellent representation of what Greeks have been throughout the centuries. Thank you for that. And also thank you for the aphorism, let Greeks be Greeks. I do not agree with all your economic analysis. But this is not the time to dwell on that.
No, by all means.
There is only one question I want to ask you. In the first half of the 20th century, Greece produced excellent, fascinating examples of musicians, scientists, writers, poets. Do I leave any area out? We have
Composers, yeah, fantastic.
fantastic examples in any area of art and the letters and the sciences. And the names are familiar to many. The Theodorakis, the Hadzidakis, the Xenakis, the Tsarouchis, the Elitis, the Seferis, and goes on. What has Greece produced in the latter half of the 20th century? And is this, let Greeks be Greeks? Do modern Greeks know what is to be Greek? And I would take that offline.
There's no question that there's a period, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, that Greek artists of all kinds were extremely prolific. Extremely. Hadjikyriakos Gikas, Moralis, Tsarouchis, many of the painters that I showed here. There's one building of the Benaki Museum dedicated only to those, and I highly suggest that one visits it when you go to Greece. I know most people that go to Athens, they want to see other things, but the wealth in that little museum is incredible. I'm not ready to say that subsidized killed the creative side of Greeks entirely, but there is, I did face a big part of the cultural nomenclature in Athens, pushing very heavily for the state to pay for things. And one thing that became very clear to me was that the moment we started scaling back funds with placing policy as a priority, the cultural institutions of Athens started creating far more interesting stuff than they had in the past. My favorite example is the Opera House. We have an opera house which actually absorbs a huge amount of the budget of the Ministry of Culture, which is kind of strange, given that opera is not, let's say, a Greek art form, as opposed to theater, for example, which has its roots in ancient Greece, where the budget is very, very low. So I went up to the people at the Opera House and I said, guys, this is unsustainable. You're selling half the house, and half of the seats are invitations. We can't keep paying for that. Either you fill up the house, or you'll have to close. And they filled up the house with amazing performances, fantastic work by the musicians, by the predecessor of the person that took over when I was there was outsourcing the whole production. So the production was costing twice as much and bringing in half the money. And the moment that this new guy took over and started having a different attitude about opera and trying to attract the average Greek to the opera house, not only did he put together great performances, but he made the opera house far more sustainable. And he alleviated some of the weight that was on our budget to keep it alive. It's a wonderful Cinderella story, and it happened. We had musicians go with double-decker open buses, and they would sing in the central square, and they would show up in cafes, and you would have a solo performance in a cafe out of nowhere. And all of that was to attract people to the opera house. And literally speaking, in the middle of the crisis, they were selling more tickets than they were selling when we were at our good times. And it's not the only example. I can give you others where creativity sort of started bubbling the moment that people realized that the previous model wasn't sustainable.
And do modern Greeks know what it means to be Greek?
What I can tell you is that Greeks are looking back to understand what it is to be Greek. There's a time that is, especially Greek Americans who went to Greece in the 90s, were quite shocked by how Greek society had changed. It was almost like a valueless society. Everything was consumerism, everything was showing off your car compared to the guy next to you, to a point where it became quite ridiculous. The most popular magazine at the time was a magazine called Click, which was, borderline pornographic. And everything in it was about, how to live a life that was not true to Greece and sustainable. And that lasted for quite some time. And it wasn't until the crisis where people started saying, wait a second, this is not who we are. And we started looking back to understand what we had left behind. And I think this is a process that's happening right now. Unfortunately, it's happening in a situation where the economic pain of what's going on is awful. So it's very difficult to ask those questions when you're, especially for the families that are living day by day. But the questions are being raised.
The Greeks are suffering now for many years as a result of the terrible economic situation. And there has been more and more austerity placed on them by the EU members. And to the point that the Greeks no longer can afford even food. They are really in desperate situation. And this austerity program is leading nowhere. Greece cannot sustain the way it's going. It's not even close. And the reality is it better to stay in the EU, in the Eurozone, or is it better to get out and even though the chaotic situation that's going to result in maybe better off or not? It's a very, very sad situation in Greece, and I want your opinion in terms of how can we get off the ground and get moving again? Thank you.
Well, I mean, that's a $6 million question, right? Actually, it's about $400 billion question. I am partial in the idea of staying in the Union and the Euro for a variety of reasons. But I think what's more important is to decide the following, that whether we stay or we go, we do it with a plan. And we do it knowing full well of what it is we're embarking on. And that is something that Greek leadership has not shown until now, which leads me to believe that even if we get out of the euro, we will do so in an unorganized and anarchic manner, which is really going to cost the lower and middle classes more than what they've paid already, and it will protect the higher classes who have moved their money outside of Greece. In other words, just to make it very simple, a refrigerator today, a refrigerator with a drachma will cost double for the guy who has their money in Greece, and will cost half the money for the person who has taken their money out of the country. And the ones who have taken their money out of the country are primarily wealthy. So it will be a second depreciation, but paid only by the lower and middle classes. And again, I'm saying that even that could be discussed and could be an option if it's done with a plan of where we want to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and to follow that plan through. Because if it's only an excuse for the Greek government to have the capacity to print money, then believe me, all past record has shown that a very centralized government that's spending like crazy will print like crazy, bringing down the value even further than the first depreciation you will have to take when you create your new currency. So if this is going to be another 20, 30, 50 years of depreciating your currency, that will just leave the Greeks poorer at the end of it than richer. So either way, whatever it is, we have to do it with a plan. And right now, we don't have even, no party today has presented a plan of either how to continue on this track or change tracks, including mine.
Okay, we have our last question right here.
Καλώς ήρθατε, κύριε Γερουλάνου.
Ευχαριστώ. Καλώς σας βρήκα.
Λέγομαι Ιωάννα Μπαρτσικά και είμαι θελόντρια σε αυτό το μουσείο. So I'm a volunteer that works often in the wonderful Greek and Roman section of the museum. I want to go back to something that very much impressed me from the things you talked about today. And I'll go back to this winged human and the emphasis on humanity across civilization, our own civilization, but also even more so, you see that humanity in the Greek theater, you see it in any gallery you walk here and you look at something, this humanity faces you, this emphasis on the human. I grew up in Greece of the 60s, and I finished high school and the Kapodiastriako University in Athens. And one thing I knew growing up in the 60s is about my Greekness, what I identified as being Greek. If I walked in the Benaki Museum those days, I could see what I learned in school portrayed in the wonderful way you exhibit things in the Benaki Museum all across time. And I was familiar. I could understand the ancient Greek, some Latin. I could understand where I was coming from. I could understand some of Byzantium. I could the Greek Revolution. And I go back to Greece every year and speak with my younger nieces and nephews. And that part that defined my Greekness and my love for Greece and my pride in being Greek, it's totally missing. The children are confused. They have been changing programs in the schools from year to year. Very little from what we were taught is taught in any significant way today. And the thing that hurts me most and also gives me the most hope about the role of museums is that they can bring back this essence and this identity by actually doing a good job in attracting these younger generations. We do it here, we try very hard, but in Greece it's badly needed. The role of museums in Greece, I think, is more important today than it ever was. And I'm very happy that you actually doing education. You're trying to do more educational programs, both in the Acropolis Museum and your museum and all the museums. And a whole group of us will visit you in September. The whole from the education department will come, 27 people of us. And we actually come, and by the exposure to the museums, even if you are not a specialist, you can get a sense of Greekness, of something that is genuinely Greek. But I very much worry about the generations, the two last generations got very little of this. And I wonder if you want to comment about, if you share in this worry.
Well, I think, is this the last question, by the way?
Yes.
There's one more out there that I am going to take, but let me answer this one first. Wherever I travel in the world, I hear my generation fearful of the way that the two new generations are being raised. I think the technology that they play in their hands with so wonderfully makes us feel a bit alienated from them. And I have two daughters today. I have two daughters at 14 and 11, which I could not fathom how they work with these new technologies and what they use them for. I have to say that, my daughters keep impressing me with what they're learning. And I'm like, where do you get this stuff? How come? I mean, their minds are like sponges, but they're picking up signals from a much larger variety of places than we did. And I'm not ready to condemn that yet. They keep surprising me with how much they know, even for their own culture, by watching shows that would have your hair rise on your head. And for some reason, you know, there is good there as well as bad. But when it comes to the Greek generations that are growing up now, I think one thing that we did extremely wrongly in Greece, and this was done by most, if not all leadership, is that we made Greeks fearful of globalization. We treated globalization as something that would destroy our culture, as opposed to portraying it as a tool to get our culture known across the world, a culture that has been relevant to the world since essentially the Renaissance, gets an opportunity to be showcased again to a much wider audience, and for far more important elements of people's life than just their academic development. This idea of the human being in the center of everything, as opposed to the economy or ideologies or religions, is to me fundamental in humanizing globalization. And I don't know what it's going to look like, but whoever's going to have a debate on the future of globalization, they will have to go back to ancient Greek values to realize that what globalization would look like if we wanted it to serve people as opposed to serving economies. So the lessons of our forefathers are there, and they're available to everyone. And instead of being defensive as to who we are and why we are who we are, I think we should be rather the exact opposite and start educating a new generation of Greeks to be far more aggressive about it, far more confident that there's nothing to lose in globalization, but instead it's a great tool by which to portray ourselves and to the world in a completely different fashion. I think it's going to happen. I have very serious faith in these values. And what we're looking at around the world today is people looking for these kinds of values. So eventually the two will meet. And I think that will be the beginning of a new renaissance, which we desperately need.